So this should be the final population ecology PowerPoint. So hang tight. I know this is a lot of watching, but right, the volume is because this AP test is tough. The AP biology test is probably one of the hardest tests to get a 5 on, which is why we have so much content that we really need to cover. The last thing we're going to talk about in reference to my population size is natural selection, right? Because natural selection, this idea of evolution, is going to change my population. Natural selection in a nutshell, right? There are 3 things that happen. I have a selective pressure. Change in environment, change in food source, I need to move somewhere, something like that. 2, variation. This means that there is some sort of survival and some sort of people, some sort of group dying off, right? Let's say it gets really, really cold in the next year, and it's cold forever. The people who are better at surviving in the cold will live and reproduce. The people who are not are going to die off and not survive, and they're going to pass on their genetics through inheritance. We talk about survival of the fittest and all of this stuff. These 3 things are key. There's something that changes, or there's something in the environment that is creating pressure. Some people survive and some people don't. And the people that survive are going to pass on their genetics, therefore passing on a lot of their physical traits as well, changing the population. There are tons of natural processes that can lead to the change in a population, the change in population size. All of these, you can see a lot of them. These are really big things that can change population size. There's also really small things. Again, we need to refer back to the quintessential example of evolution, right? This guy, hopefully you can name him, talks about the idea of the finch beak size. We saw that these finches arrived at the Galapagos. There was one species, and very quickly, depending on where they lived, they had access to different types of resources, different types of food, and certain birds were better at eating that food than others. Those birds survived, those birds reproduced, and those birds shaped what the future of the population looked like. Beak size was what determined if you were going to survive or not, and if you were going to be able to pass on your own genetics, right? Darwin's finches. If you don't remember that, bring it up in class. We'll talk about it. So when we talk about population size, there are 3 modes of selection. The first is disruptive selection. Basically, what can happen is that something can occur and it'll split the species up into 2 different groups. It'll isolate these 2 different groups. Stabilizing selection, it basically chops off the extremes. So organisms within the population that are one extreme and the other, and it makes them far more uniform. Directional selection, it's going to push the population in a certain way. Not only does this change the size, it obviously changes the genetic makeup of what the population is like. And I know that we like to think about the physical evidence, right? We talk about beaks, but what's really important here is the genetic makeup, the alleles and the genes that are present. Because that dictates what my physical traits are going to be. And because this is an AP course, we need to think about this very scientifically. Not only do they vary physically, right, my phenotype, they vary genotypically. This is another example of the modes of selection. It gives you a little bit more information. Feel free to jot this down in your notes if you would like. This is an example of a scenario where we see this occurring. These photographs show the same location on an island following a hurricane. This is in the Gulf of Mexico. This was a geological survey. What would happen to the population of birds who derive their diet from the treetops? Because what we see, and I know that it's hard to see, is that, and it gives you a little red reference point, we see our foliage in our trees, and then we see that all of these treetops have basically been chopped off due to the hurricane. Usually hurricanes will break a lot of tree branches and kind of knock over a lot of trees. So we want to think about these birds, right? They derive their diet from the treetops. This population had a wide range of beak sizes. We want to think about A, what happens to the gene pool over a certain amount of time that favors smaller beaks, and what is going to happen 10 years in the future. There's two things that we should have thought when we saw this image. One, we're going to see that there's going to be natural selection occurring for finches with smaller beak size. They're still going to be able to feed, therefore they are going to survive and pass on their genetics. The organisms that can't feed will eventually die. What we'll see is that this is going to be a directional selection. It's selecting for one specific trait. The extremes are not going to survive. The ones in the middle are not. This is going to push the population in a specific direction. Again, we see that the beak selection after the hurricane is going to look like this. The last thing is I want to bring it back to this image that we've already saw, right? That there's certain things that we look at to determine why a species is moving in a certain direction, right? We look at actual dispersal, so location. Does physical restraints impact the dispersion? Does behavior, biotic factors like other organisms, and then physical and chemical factors? Do those help us understand how a species distributes, or a population? So things we need to think about with population are the size and how the size changes, how the actual genetic pool changes, and then how their location changes, right? So the three things that we've covered about those populations thus far, most of what we talked about was size, right, and the rate of growth and all those things. The next thing that we talked about was the actual genes, right, natural selection, and then briefly we just reflected back on how they move and how they disperse. So this would be another example of how natural selection impacts the hydrangea flower. If you've ever been on Cape Cod, or if you've ever traveled to the coastal areas of Massachusetts, we see this flower a lot. They ultimately react to the environment, and their phenotype is based on the pH of the soil. So these are actually interesting. It's not genetic. The hydrangea flower color is affected by light and soil pH. And so this is a primary example of why we need to be careful about talking about natural selection. A lot of people, right, we talk about the fact that, oh, while they're alive, they adapt, and then they pass on those genes. That doesn't happen, right? I either have those genes or I don't. And if I survive to pass on those genes, that's how a population changes. If I don't have those traits, I'm never going to have those traits, and it moves on. The hydrangea flower and a couple other organisms are an example of how I can see species change within one generation, right? Hypothetically, if I picked up this hydrangea and moved it to a different soil area, my flower color would change. But this does not happen with other species. This is not how natural selection works. And it's a good example of what does not happen. So I want to see, let's see how far along we are. I want to kind of skip over the fish and things like that for now. I just want to focus lastly on introduced species, because this is kind of what is most focused on with the AP Bio test. Introduced species are anything that are brought to a new environment and they were originally not there. They are transplanted. Eventually they can sometimes become invasive species. If you've ever heard of the term invasive species before. We talk about the brown tree snake was actually introduced into Guam during World War II. If we know the the war in the Pacific, right, that was part of World War II. This is a highly invasive species. It has driven 12 species of birds and 6 species of lizards into extinction, right? These invasive species can be highly toxic to the area. Another example in the U.S. is the kudzu vine. I've actually seen this when I lived in Arkansas. These were introduced actually on purpose. Someone brought them in as like a decorative plant for this like pavilion, and it was also to use to help control erosion. They have really deep roots and they kind of like crawl over things. They have taken over the landscape of the southern U.S. In the left picture, you'll see that that's actually plants on top of trees, and they will kill all the foliage. It wasn't ornamental, not so ornamental anymore. In New York, another example of this is the European starling. there was this like drug manufacturer in New York City who basically, he was very eccentric. He also did a lot of drugs. Released 60 of these European starlings that he had imported. He wanted them to be very like romantic birds because they were mentioned in Shakespeare. The starlings basically overtook everything. And if you ever go to New York, they are the largest bird population, and they are very invasive. They look like this if you've ever seen them. They are very costly and very noxious birds. They basically will devour all seeds and fruit. They basically gobble up like a large amount of any sort of fruit. And so we know that this, right, will allow other plants to continue to grow, right? I have fruit, I have seeds in them. They basically will kill off large groups of plants. They have basically impacted, this one species has impacted the agriculture of the United States because they are so dangerous to plants. Another example that we see all the time is zebra mussels. Zebra mussels were brought to the Great Lakes from the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. They basically colonize the whole water area, and they damage harbors, waterways, ships, boats. They basically will eat through the metal of things and cover everything, killing any space for any other organisms. They cling to like pipes and they can clog stuff. They basically are highly invasive as well. The interesting thing about invasive species is they can defy this idea that like in the optimum range, species are going to thrive. Essentially, they have a much wider optimum range, meaning they will inhabit a much larger distribution. What we look is that we have our optimum range, the zone of physiological stress, and the zone of intolerance, which is like the organisms can't live there. Our invasive species have a much larger optimum range, which is kind of the big issue with our invasive species. Another example is the snakehead fish. They basically eat zooplankton, larvae, crustaceans, other young fish. They also feed on fishes, crustaceans, frogs, reptiles, small mammals. They are highly predatory and they disrupt the food web, therefore disrupting the ecosystem. They are also an invasive species. If you want to look up the video, you can. We are going to start talking about sea urchins in an inquiry-based lab. This is a little introduction to that. So once we get to class, this is what we're going to be talking about. Some things to start thinking about are that we have our sea urchins, and they are limiting biotic factors in a particular ecosystem. And we want to look at what happens when I change the number of sea urchins that exist. This is the image that we're going to start talking about, which basically looks at what happens when I to the seaweed cover if I remove both of these, what happens if I only remove one, what happens if I remove none of them. We're going to talk about this. I would recommend pausing in here and just making sure you understand how these three things interact. And so we're going to pause here. The bulk of what we will talk about we will do through lab, and hopefully you have a good sense of this idea of population ecology. Remember, what we talked about are the three big things that you should take out of this are that, one, right, population size fluctuates for a variety of reasons. Two, the genetic makeup is going to fluctuate a lot. And then three, when we look at where it is located, why it's located somewhere, we talk about invasive species and all of those things, that's going to be the third thing that we need to understand.